All right, Saagar, what are you looking at?
Well, anytime there's a foreign policy crisis on horizon, the historical analogies all start flying. As Godwin's law states, the longer an online discussion goes, regardless of topic or scope, the probability of a comparison to Nazis or Adolf Hitler reaches 1. Godwin came up with that rule in 1990, in the early days of the internet. But for foreign policy, it's actually been afflicting our thinking long before, all the way since 1939. And I continue to see it today in the Ukraine crisis. For the advocates of the most bellicose position against Russia, the Ukraine crisis today is a simple replay of the Munich crisis of 1938. Hitler and Putin are revanchist leaders who seek to restore the glory of their former countries. They are willing to use belligerent force to accomplish this and to exploit the international system plagued by war weariness to stage high-stakes gambles that get what they want. In this telling of history, the answer of what to do is quite obvious. We must then do what the world failed to do at Munich, to stand up to Hitler, or in this case Putin, and say, enough is enough. And that is what the UK defense minister just said days ago, as I just showed you. I came to write this monologue after my own study of Munich recently, sparked by 3 different things. Number 1, it was the excellent movie on Netflix titled Munich, The Edge of War. It actually caused me to buy a book. It's called Appeasement, Chamberlain, Hitler, Churchill, and the Road to War by Tim Bouvier. And then finally, I just read the first volume JFK biography by Frederick Longeval, which spends a lot of time on the pre-war diplomacy of Europe. Now, I've got to tell you something. While I think Munich may be one of the most important events in world history, the invoking of it to justify wars in the future may end up doing substantial damage. Given the horrors of the Second World War, a lot of the worst of Munich and the Holocaust, obviously, are just the subsequent failures also to stop Hitler. They are burned into consciousness of any moral and good person, especially a person who thinks about foreign policy. But let's actually break it down when it comes to Ukraine. For the comparison for Munich to work, Vladimir Putin has to be a genocidal madman, hell-bent on the domination of all of Western Europe, and Ukraine has to be the opening salvo in a bloody and a long campaign. Now ask yourself the question, is there any evidence to support that whatsoever? The Ukraine crisis today is the result of a long and simmering tension between post-Soviet Russia and the West about the balance of power on the European continent. Any sane person can see that NATO expansion all the way up to the Russian border is bound to cause a reaction. And in fact, if you compare Putin to the long arc of Russian history, a Russian czar paranoid of Western influence and seeking defense in depth through expansion outwards, that's about as typical as it comes. In other words, is Putin Hitler? Or is he just your average Russian leader who's been trying to annex Ukraine since 1667? The reason that this matters is because if he's the former, it justifies World War III. If it's the latter, well, then we have a range of options, different foreign policy comparisons that we can draw from. The reason I'm laying it out this way is to reveal the mental traps that we can find ourselves in, which may narrow our scope of options and imagination during a foreign policy crisis. There's another aspect, though, to Munich that the hawks who invoke it today never consider. Munich was the dominant policy preference of the entire West at the time. Chamberlain was hailed as a hero in the UK for preventing a war. France and the rest of the West were reeling from the Great Depression. The memory of the Somme and Verdun and Passchendaele was too fresh for most people. And the truth was, there was almost no domestic political condition that would have produced a different outcome than Munich, which was first observed, actually, by our own 35th president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, at just 20-something years old when he wrote Why England Slept in the year 1940. Now, why does this forgotten truth matter? Because something that the hawks of today like to disregard is the feeling of the public. They wish away the whims of the electorate, who today is roundly against intervention in Ukraine whatsoever. Well, why is that exactly? Maybe it's because the last time Munich was invoked by an American president to justify a war, it was September 2002 by George W. Bush for the war in Iraq. Something that the hawks never consider is that the reason Munich happened in the first place is because Europe and America's elite promised them that the horrific First World War was the war to end all wars. And then, when they started raising the possibility of it again, just a generation later, people said, well, hold on a second. I don't want to do that again. Is there not a lesson in that? Should the hawks not then learn this lesson? if you're going to lead a democratic public to war, you better not do so under false pretenses or make too big of promises, because if you do so and it ends up being a disaster, generational memory is long, and they will remain suspicious of you and any war in the future, even if it is a righteous cause, like destroying Nazism and taking on Hitler. And as I digest the recent history, I've just taken in the real lesson of Munich to me, that when elites betray the public and you lead them to a war with false promises, and when that reality is really confronted, the long-standing effects of that are going to linger for decades. I'm sure any hawk who's listening to this is just going to say, oh yes, the silly public, they just have to learn how to differentiate. That's the problem. America's elite can never fail. They can only be failed. Their invasion of Iraq and NATO expansion and conception of American foreign policy is always right. It's you who are too dumb to know the difference. Or, and I again posit, or maybe we do know better because we learned to start asking questions for ourselves as to what should really be done. So as the lectures on MSNBC or from the White House continue, and you try to convince you otherwise, don't let their false appeals to history move you. It is a selective one at best, one that hopes to override the experience of your eyes and ears. And as we saw at Munich, sometimes there are downfalls to that. But in the long run, the skepticism of the public based upon lies from above may itself be what saves this country and many, many others. I've just been, turning this over my head. I hear this all the time. Oh, appeasement, appeasement, appeasement. First of all, most of the people say that. They don't know a goddamn thing.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.